أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق الأجمعين باعث الأنبياء والمرسلين ثم الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا حبيبنا حبيب قلوبنا وشفيء نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. أما بعد فقد قال الله في كتابه مبين أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صلوات على محمد وآل محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل. Brothers and sisters, we continue with our series of discussion where we mentioned that the final 7 days of the holy month of Ramadan we will be covering 7 deadly spiritual diseases. And we see that, of course, spiritual diseases, as per our analysis and as per our analogy, we see they are very similar to those diseases that we would have physically. We must first identify them, we must first diagnose them, and then after that we can treat them. So we have been doing, of course, the same thing with the illnesses that would befall one's soul, that would befall one's heart. And we see that when we talk about the illnesses of oneself, and when we talk about the pollution of one's soul, we see that these diseases are the things that corrupt us further. These diseases then do not allow us to strive towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These diseases are the reason we do not find that spirituality after salah. These diseases are the reason we do not feel that ma'nawiyya after engaging in ibadah. Of course, when, for example, we go for ziyarah, when we go on a trip that is based in spirituality, after that we feel this spiritual high. After that we feel this atmosphere and this environment of spirituality itself. Then we ask ourselves the question, why doesn't this maintain and why doesn't it sustain? Because we have these illnesses within inside our own hearts that then dull that light that was emanating previously. So the first thing we must do, of course, is the diagnosis of the disease itself, and then we can move forward in actually treating it. We mentioned in our previous discussions, of course, the first of the spiritual diseases that we spoke about was hasad. And we stated that the danger of hasad is that it can corrupt someone's iman entirely. We moved forward on the treatments of such, and of course, inshallah, that leads us to today's bahth. Today, of course, which is day 3 of our series in the 7 spiritual diseases that we will be covering, we will be looking at a particular disease that is dangerous for the reason that an individual who possesses it, most time they don't even know that they have it. And we see that this disease is one that it can pour and permeate into every level of our ibadah. Our salah can have this particular disease. Our siyam can have this particular disease. Our hajj, our zakat, our charity can all have this particular disease and ailment. And Alama, as I mentioned, Alama Tabatabai rahmatullah alayhi, he uses the terminology of a disease specifically and explicitly for this reason, because you can see that it can spread if not addressed. The sin and the disease that we are referring to, respected brothers and sisters, is of course riyah. When we look at riyah and when we look at ostentation, we see that this is something that is extremely prevalent, extremely common in our societies, in modernities, post-modernities. We can see that this is a behavior that's perpetuated, that's encouraged almost to a degree. So therefore, first of all, we must define our term. What do we mean by riyah? When we look at riyah, we see that riyah is defined as doing something for the sake of someone else or something else than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So for example, I may pray. However, is this prayer for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or is it for the sake of so that I can look good in the community? I give charity. Is this charity for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or is it for the sake of so that I can have this particular standing? I fast and I break my fast and I engage in the communal matters. However, is this with pure sincerity and ikhlas, or is it delving into the realms of riyah? As mentioned, we think that, the diseases that we are speaking about are things that don't concern us. They don't influence us. But when we look at how discreet these diseases can actually creep up on us, then we start taking them into more serious consideration. We look at the tradition by Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, where he states that riyah is a particular disease that's more hidden than what? As I said, we think that this is something obvious and clear. We either have it or we don't. He says Riya is a disease that's more hidden than a moving black ant on a black rock in the middle of the night. We see that how difficult is it for one to perceive a black ant on a black rock in the middle of the night that's moving? It's impossible. It's incredibly difficult to see the movement of this ant. So therefore, when we look at Riya, we see that it can also creep up on us on these ways. We see that discreetly, and we see through other means. We start with good intentions and we start sincerely. However, ultimately and inevitably, we see that sometimes shaitan is able to influence and corrupt this good deed into something that's bad, into something that's terrible. We see that Ayat al-Bahjat was asked the same question, that how is it that I can now reroute my intentions? He said, if we are doing Riya to show off to somebody or to show off to people, he said simply reroute this to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and try to show off to Him and try to allow Him to be the source of your admiration and recognition. So we see that the danger and the difficulty of, for example, an individual elongating their prayer because someone is listening. For someone, for example, engaging in extra ibadah because they are in the company of others. We see now we start falling into this very dangerous path, which is what the ulama refer to as shirk khafi, as a minor shirk. And we see that the analogy that they bring of Riya is of a minor shirk itself, where we see that we are disassociating from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because we are now depending on entities other than Him. There was a particular story where they mentioned that a person, he was engaging in prayer. And in his engagement in prayer, he heard footsteps behind him. So he started elongating his prayer. He was reciting very beautifully, mashallah, with all the maqamat and the tilawat. And then when he finished his prayer, he did the salam, he turned around and he found out that the sound of what was occurring in the masjid was a cat that entered. And he did all of this for the sake of a cat that had walked in. So therefore, when we reanalyze and when we look at our intentions, we see that it's genuinely as foolish as this. If we do things for the sake of anything other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all of our intentions must then be realigned. There was a particular individual and he was very insistent on praying salah in the first row. MashaAllah, it was a very good intention. He said that every salah I want to engage in, I want to make sure that I'm not only in the masjid for each salah, but I'm in the first row for each salah. He did this for how many years? Decades. One particular day happened where something occurred at home and he rushed to the masjid. The salah had begun and the first row was filled. He said, okay, I'm late now, so I'll go back home and I'll pray there. He went back home. When he went back home, he sat down and he contemplated. He said, why didn't I pray in the masjid? Because I wasn't able to join the first row. And then he's like, for all of these years, have I been praying for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Or have I been praying for the sake of being in the first row? Then he understood all of the salah that I have engaged in the last 20 years are obsolete. He repeated all of the prayers and he continued in that manner. So we see that when we look at our intentions, what truly are we doing the things that we are doing for? We understand that there are directions. When we're children and there's a tarbiyah, there's a direction from our parents. However, we need to understand, us as autonomous, independent thinking human beings, we have the ability to think. And we have the ability to make free choices. And we have this free will and this ikhtiyar that we need to implement. So therefore, if we engage, for example, in fasting, as we are doing in this holy month, we need to think, why? Why is it that I am engaging in this fasting? And we see that even if an individual starts with an intention that is noble, we can see nonetheless, even though they have started in a particularly good way, afterwards they have the potential to be misguided. Afterwards they have the potential to go on the wrong paths. We see this with many of the companions of the Holy Prophet, do we not? Many of them started with the Holy Prophet. Many of them started with Imam Ali himself. However, afterwards we see they have taken a separate path entirely. We see when we look at the character of Zubair, it's said that Amir al-Mu'mineen used to weep over Zubair. He used to cry over the betrayal of Zubair, of when he betrayed him and then started fighting for the opposition. Because we see that they were incredibly close. He was the one who defended Amir al-Mu'mineen when the opposition came after Saqifa. And then after that we can see his intention was blinded entirely. So it's not the case that we start with the right intention and now that's all that's going to be. No. We see that you must start with the right intention and continue to maintain the correct intention. So we need to reanalyze ourselves at every part of the journey, not just at the beginning, but during the middle and at the end as well. Which is why we look at the niyyah al-salah and why the niyyah al-salah is so important. It's not just the niyyah that we have at the beginning. Rather, we see this niyyah is existent in the sajda, is existent in the ruku', and is existent in all forms. To the degree where we have some ulama and some of the marajit to say that it is makruh to say the niyyah at the beginning of the salah. Because then some people would think it's a part of salah, rather than thinking that it's the entirety of salah. Because the niyyah needs to be existent in every element. The same way our intention needs to be existent in every second of the a'mal that we engage in. Not just at the beginning, but rather during, and not just during, but rather in the end as well. Therefore we see, in order for us to maintain this sincerity, this integrity, we first of all look at our intentions before engaging in an amal in the first place. And after we've engaged in it, we need to constantly be asking ourselves, am I still doing this for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Or am I doing this because I'm getting recognition? Am I still doing this for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Or am I doing it for a reason other than Him? We see that it's in the engagement of the self, it's the engagement of our behavior, it's in the psychoanalysis of a person's own behavior, that we can truly understand if we are doing things for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or if we are not. Therefore, we see what the true danger of riyā is that we develop a dependency. We develop a dependency on somebody or something other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So for example, if an individual is doing something, and now they start getting praise and recognition, and now that praise and recognition is the only reason they are engaging in that particular act, they've taken their dependency away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and given it in the hands of the people. If this is not shirk khafi, brothers and sisters, what is? We see that when an individual does a particularly good act, a particularly good deed, we see that of course they have the correct intentions going in, but moving forward, are those intentions correct? We must be honest with ourselves. We must be honest with ourselves. We must be sincere. That this thing that I am doing, is it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or is this thing that I am doing for the sake of the praise that I will get from my peers around me, from my family around me? It's a very difficult path, and it's a very concise path. And the reason why it's one of the most dangerous diseases of the soul is because we can see it can creep up so discreetly. Other sins are quite clear. Murder is clear, right? Adultery is clear. These things are clear. However, riyā is so discreet. It's something that can just seep into our, as a mu'min, seep into our lives, seep into our existence, and then it can cause a lot of destruction afterwards. So therefore, understanding this danger, seeing that the dependence that we have on other people is something that will take us away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we then reanalyze ourselves. We reanalyze our behavior, and we reanalyze the direction that we are going in. And for example, if we look at the modern context, we can use the case study of social media. If I put something on social media that is positive, that is good, that is for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's me, for example, showing an act of charity, or an act of spreading knowledge, or an act of worship, or an act of ibadah, I need to ask myself honestly and sincerely, am I doing this for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or am I doing this for the sake of the praise and the accreditation that I will get from others? Right? The famous Pakistani phrase that we hear ultimately and inevitably, that all of us have heard in our childhood, and this has continued generation by generation, lo kya kehenge. At the end of the day, we see, do we actually live our lives by the ideals of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or do we live our life by the ideals of what the community may say to me? Or what, for example, my family members may say to me? So therefore, when I shift my intention to what will the community think, to what would Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala think, therefore we see that very same amal is now transformed into ibadah. That same amal that was taking us to hell beforehand is now taking us to heaven. Because we see the amal itself is not changed. Salah is salah. We can have two people praying in front of me right now. One person's salah is identical to the other person's salah, apparently. However, if one person is praying for the sake of getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the other person is praying for the sake of, for example, getting validation from the community around them, we can see one person's salah is taking them to heaven, and one person's salah is taking them to hell. The exact same amal, the exact same act, but the intention and the niyyah behind it change everything. So therefore we see that the a'mal that we do are incredibly important, and we engage in these a'mal, which is why you are here. You engage in the a'mal of coming and reading the salah, of opening your fasting congregation, of listening to the dua, of listening to the majlis. We see that the a'mal that we do, alhamdulillah, saraja, they are at their place. They hold their correct value. However, we see that the a'mal, well and good, they might be there. However, the intention behind the amal, have we maintained the sincerity there? The intention behind the act, have we upholded the truth in this regard? If we have, well and good. If we haven't, we must take review. We must take review of ourselves and see, are we doing these things for ourselves? Are we doing these things for others? Or are we doing these things for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And we see, for example, the traditions of Imam Zayn al-Abidin, salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala. Where we see in the example of Imam Zayn al-Abidin, he had a concerted effort. When he used to engage and give charity, he wanted to be as anonymous as possible. He would go in the middle of the night. He would go with his face covered. He would go and give, and he would address the needs of the needy, and then he would come back and no one would know it was him. Amir al-Mu'mineen in the same manner. The only time that they actually found out that it was Amir al-Mu'mineen who was giving them this sustenance, it was Amir al-Mu'mineen who was giving them this food, it was Amir al-Mu'mineen who was giving them this water, was when he passed away. And then no one was giving them the food, and no one was giving them the water. And then they found out and came to the conclusion that it was the Imam who passed away that was coming veiled and hidden in the night to give us this charity. So we see that the Ma'sumeen themselves, they took a very concerted effort to make sure that there isn't even an element of the ego that's involved in the a'mal that they did. Because we can see it's so easy to creep in. It's so easy to creep in. And we can see that whatever we do in order to maintain our sincerity, shaitan is inevitably going to find a way. Our own nafs will find a way to make that act corrupt in and of itself. So the reason why this particular sin is so discreet and this disease is incredibly polluting is because it spreads multifold. And when we look at, again, these acts and a'mal and ourselves, we look at the things that we do. Spreading knowledge is good. Praying is good. Fasting is good. This is not an advertisement against these a'mal. However, the whole purpose and the point of our discussion is this, is that an individual who engages these things with the right intentions, they must make sure that they are doing so for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Therefore, for example, if I have social media, and I post on social media this remarkable thing that I have done, I have donated to charity, before I post, I must ask myself the question, am I doing this so that I can get validation from my family and from my friends around me? Or am I doing this sincerely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And if I'm doing it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, am I taking the measures in place that Imam Zayn al-Abidin did, that Imam Ali did, to make sure that they made themselves as anonymous as possible, so that no element of the ego can come and pollute my intention and the amal itself? So we see when these people used to engage in good deeds, they used to make themselves as anonymous as possible. However, when we engage in good deeds, we try to make ourselves as public as possible. That we are doing this and we are engaging in this. So therefore, when we look at that discussion, we see that there is a tradition from Amir al-Mu'mineen, Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, where he states that if you are ever at a crossroad when it comes to a decision, as we all have been at some point in our life, there's a decision, and you don't know whether to take this one or that one. He said, take the path which has least benefit to you. Take the path which yourself would benefit from least. Because we see that if there is even an element of benefit for us, we see that we will go for that. And we will say we're doing it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but ultimately we're doing it for our own benefit. We will say we're doing it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but ultimately we're doing it for validation and accreditation from others. We're saying we're doing it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but in fact we see the only purpose that we are engaging in this thing, the only purpose that we are posting about it, the only purpose that we are publicizing it, is so that we can get this social currency from whoever it is that we may deem valuable. So we see that this discussion of riyā is of course incredibly important, and it is laced with the concept of intention and niyyah. So therefore a person's niyyah must be conscious and constant throughout every element of their day. It's not just that we make a niyyah and we move forward with it, no. We don't just make a niyyah at the beginning of Ramadan and then we don't think about that intention for the rest. No, we see the niyyah is the soul of an action. The niyyah exists in every element of what we do. So therefore, when we are fasting, it's not just at the beginning of Ramadan we make this intention and we move on. It's every moment that I am fasting, I am saying that I am doing this for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I'm doing this for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Therefore, when I'm doing khidmah in the mosque, it's in the forefront of my mind, I'm doing this for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Therefore, when I'm praying, I'm saying that I'm doing this for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When I'm attending the majlis and I'm listening, I'm saying I'm doing this for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We see that if this niyyah, if this intention is at the forefront of one's mind, we see riyā itself can be dissipated. And we see that the solutions, of course, given to us by the Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, is that in order for one to get away from this disease of riyā and ostentation, act in anonymity. Act in anonymity. Do work in a way, of course, some work has to be public. For example, this lecture that I'm giving, it wouldn't be very good if, for example, I was in another room and giving a lecture and it was just recorded on tape. it would lose its value and lose its benefit. However, just because there are certain things that we do in a day that are of benefit, that are public, doesn't mean that there aren't things in the day that we can do that are of benefit, that can be private. So therefore now it's my responsibility to make sure that I engage in a'mal that get me closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that absolutely no one knows about. It's therefore all of our responsibility to make sure that we all engage in a'mal that absolutely nobody knows about but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is the importance of Salat al-Layl. When we look at Salat al-Layl, of course, we look at all of the other salah, of course they are wajib and they are at their place. However, when we look at Salat al-Layl, we see when you wake up at that particular time of the night, and you genuinely feel that there's no one else in the universe but you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you communicate and when you speak to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at this time, you see there is nothing of the ego involved in this at all. You are genuinely doing this so that you may communicate with the divine. You are genuinely doing this so that you may communicate and liaise with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore we see, in order for us to get away from this disease of riyā, we see that we must engage with an active niyyah and intention, and we must make sure that we act in any degree that we can in anonymity. If it is at all possible, do any good deed in anonymity. If it is at all possible, do any good amal, so that absolutely nobody knows about it. And if we see this being the case, we can then recollect our intention and actually do things for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is the purpose of our life and the purpose of our existence, is it not? So we come to the end of our discussion as our time has come to an end. And we see that riya, ostentation, is a disease that is prevalent and exists. More so in current times than we can say in previous times, because of the existence of the superficial means of media, such as social media and so on and so forth, where it's just the zahir and the apparent that an individual goes and judges on. So we see this disease, we've identified it, but what did we say in the introduction? It's not just good enough to diagnose the disease, it must be treated too. So therefore, what's the treatment? What's the antidote of the particular disease of riya? As mentioned a couple times over the course of our discussion, we see it is entirely ikhlas. An individual who has the traits of ikhlas, an individual who is sincere, an individual who genuinely does something for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we see riya would not be able to come inside that dictionary definition at all. We see even shaitan attests to this. He said, I will misguide all of your servants, apart from the mukhlasin, apart from those who have ikhlas, apart from those who have sincerity, apart from those who have purified themselves. So we can see that it's only an individual who has this element and this trait of ikhlas. It's only an individual who has this element and this trait of being mukhlas, of being purified from any other dependency but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Which is when we start to enter the discussion of saying that, are we doing this thing for us or are we doing this thing for others? If we are doing it for others, we can see that the validation we get for them, we're going to be dependent upon it. And that's where you see the ebbs and the weans in the mood, for example, and the mental health epidemic that we are currently seeing is as a result of the validation we get from others. If we're getting good validation, our mood is high. If we're not getting good validation, our mood is low. I ask you, what validation is constant? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's or the people? What validation is always going to maintain? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's or the people? So therefore, when we take the power away from the people, the validation away from the people, and we give it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we see this is the ultimate source of happiness and longevity. And it's the solution to any dhulumat or darknesses that a person may have within inside their own head. A person may have within inside their own soul, because we can see it is addressed by the nur of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, however, only if an individual is sincere. So therefore, we conclude on that note as our time has come to an end. But we see ikhlas is the means by which we can get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And ikhlas is the means by which we can purify ourselves. Ikhlas, if we look at the root letters of it, of course looking at kha, lam and sad, we see that this of course is the derivation of letters that is used to refer to something khalis as well, something pure. So we see purity and sincerity, they both have the same root. Purity and sincerity, they are part of the same discussion. So therefore, when we are talking about the concept of sincerity, we are talking about an individual who is pure from absolutely any other attachments or any other expectation or any other dependency apart from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We see that once this purity is achieved, once this purity is attained, only then can we say this individual has attained the utter ikhlas. Therefore, when we talk about the tahara, especially of the members of the Ahlul Bayt, this is the point that we are alluding to. We say that the tahara that we say that is attributed to the Ahlul Bayt is not just there in a metaphysical sense. It's not just there as an abstract construct, but rather it's there to show us that their sincerity and their intention was purely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we look at, for example, the verse of the Holy Quran, إِنَّمَا يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ لِيَذْهَبَ عَنْكُمُ الرِّجْسَ أَهْلَ الْبَيْتِ وَيُطَهِّرَكُمْ تَطْهِيرًا اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. We see that this verse is one of tathir. This verse is one of purity. This verse is one of tahara. So we see that this aspect of tahara and this aspect of being khalis is intertwined with the entire philosophy and the concept of being sincere and having the ikhlas. So therefore, our bahth is this. When we look at riya, when we look at ostentations, we can see that it would creep up on us in very, very discreet ways, that we would not even know that we are engaging in riya. So therefore, the only way that we can combat it is to constantly take checks of ourselves. Why is it that I am engaging in this amal? Why is it that I am engaging in this action? And is it for the sake of people or their admiration? Or is it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And we see when an individual approaches life with this lens of tahara and this lens of sincerity and ikhlas, we see that the power that has been afforded to the people, and therefore our health, mental, physical and otherwise, that is now at that behest of the population to see whether they choose to give you this validation or not, is taken away from them and given to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And of course we can see He as the ultimate source of love, Him as the ultimate source of rahmah, Him as the ultimate source of mercy, is inevitably going to be a better entity to address our needs of validation which we need, of esteem which we need. However, if they come from Him, this is something that will be sustainable. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inshallah, to grant us the sifa of ikhlas. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to rid ourselves of any form of riya. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have shifa, to grant shifa to all the marid. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have mercy upon all the souls who have passed away. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless the organizers of this majlis and continue to grant them tawfiq. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless the attendees of this majlis and to continue to grant them tawfiq. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to hasten the reappearance of Imam Sahib al-Asr wa Zaman. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept our ta'at and ibadat for the rest of the holy month. Wa akhir da'wana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Salawat ala Muhammad wa alihi al-tahirin.